picture.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so that was about my day jobs that I've had, but also I started my master's in marine archaeology back in the 90s, and that's where I really got a flavor for searching for shipwrecks using the same technologies that we used with the Navy for searching for other things. And then also I learned a lot about the history, and it was very interesting to realize that just right here in our own state, there's so much history from the 1700s, not only just from the uh, the events that happened, but the technology as well. And so, what I'd like to do is explain number one, why the San Fernando is missing, right, when it sank, and then also how we would go for almost 400 years in the past and try to figure out how their technologies worked to know where they were, or in this case, where they shouldn't have been, and then try to bring that into modern technology and discover something that to this point they haven't been able to find. It's the last of 20 ships that sank off the Keys in 1733. And so that's essentially what the talk is about. First, I'll go over the history of the sinking event and then the existing documentation that we've been able to find in the archives. Then we'll go into how we're going to take, again, the science of the past and bring it into the present. And then lastly, some of the stuff that we found for it. So if you're here ready to write some coordinates down where the gold is, I'm not going to give you that. But I'll give you a general hint of where it is. All right? It's in the Keys. So if that's what you're here for, just leave the tip at the door and then head out. But all right, cool. So, and I wasn't originally on the team, but I was brought in 2008 to do just what I mentioned, use some of my skills from the Navy and ocean engineering to try to locate. The project archaeologist, Robert Benson, he was a classmate of mine at Nova Southeastern in marine archaeology for a few years. That's how I knew him. Mick O'Connor, he is a UPS pilot. He just retired after like 40 some years, I think, as a UPS transit pilot. He used to fly from Miami to Hong Kong and back. So he's a very patient man. Um, and then Joe Kimball, he's a legend among the treasure hunters down in the Keys. He's found so much stuff. And so he came along as an advisor and also to help us do some of this stuff. And then Juan Torres, he's an airline mechanic, but he has a passion for searching for ships as well. And that cool guy in the middle is myself. And so this is the team that, again, they brought me on in 2008. They'd been doing it for several years before that. But I brought along the technology and actually looking into the details of trying to locate where these things were, okay? So why were the ships even here? Okay, well, I'm sure we all know that back from the 1500s to the 1700s, Spain in particular every year they came over to the New World to pillage whatever they could find, both in Peru and up in the Mexican area, as well as Central America. And so there were two fleets that would come through. In the early part of the year, the Tierra Firma would come over and they would go into Cartagena, and they were mostly bringing the silver from the Potosi mines down in Peru, one of the largest silver mines in the world. They were bringing that that silver up, putting it into their ships, and eventually going back with Spain with it to fill the coffers of the king. A second fleet later in the year was the Flota, which is the fleet. They would come over to Veracruz, and they were pillaging the Mayans and other Central American and South American, and North American cultures for all of their gold and other treasures. Getting in the middle of summer, they would meet in Havana, which we know it now as Havana, but it was in the old days, it was called La Havana, the haven, right? The safe place to go before you got ready for your long trip back to Spain. And so they would come there and they would get everything together and then they would start heading back to Spain. And by doing that, they had to head through the Florida Straits between Florida and the Bahamas. And they took advantage of the Gulf Stream, which is something else I study, but that's another talk. And they would just basically ride the Gulf Stream up and then head out and across the Atlantic to Spain. This is another chart showing the similar activities. And so you'd have the Flota coming from Mexico. You'd have the Tierra Firma coming from down South America. They'd meet, head up through the Florida Straits. And this here is not where the wrecks are. So don't take pictures and say, oh, let's see if I can figure out where that is. This is in 1715. There was another very famous fleet that went ashore in Fort Pierce in 1715. And Mel Fisher, that's where he got his start in treasure hunting. and then later the Atocha off of the Keys and that sort of thing. So 1715, it was 17 ships that went aground up there. Down here, there were 20 ships that went aground, which I'll talk about. So what is certainly obvious to us, especially with this year and the last few years, is that when you try to go through here in the summer, what are you most likely to encounter? Right. If you're going to go through there, chances are that you're going to encounter some sort of bad weather in the summer years, right? So this is from 1851 up until the present, well, the present a few years ago. And this just shows the proclivity, I don't get to use that word very often, but the proclivity of hurricanes to strike just in the Florida Straits, precisely where these vessels had to go. They'd come up, get about to Bermuda, and then they'd head to Spain over in this area, okay? So, and of course, the Spanish were aware of that, but the king needed his gold, right? And his silver. So they would just head out on orders, and most of the times they'd make it, but every once in a while, they would get caught by a hurricane and get wrecked, and they'd lose all that fortune. And one of the interesting things is, they always talk about the galleons are carrying all this gold. Well, the majority of what they were carrying from the New World was silver, right? The plate fleets, they called it, because plata in Spanish is silver, right? And so the plate fleets would come across, and it was mostly silver, but there was gold. But again, you think of pirates and shipwrecks and stuff, it's all about the gold, but it's mostly silver. Okay, so what happens when you're in a storm? Well, you're in the 1500s to the 1700s, there's these wooden vessels. They're not particularly designed by naval architects, and so their stability and their survivability in high seas, just the technology wasn't there. They were usually top heavy because you had the sails trying to pull the ship, and so they were very top heavy in seas. But what was fortunate is once the sails and the mast were gone, it was like a weeble, right? It would wobble, but most of the time it would stay afloat because it had all this weight down in the keel. That's where they would put the gold, right, to keep the weight down. And so 9 times out of 10, if they could stay offshore, they could survive, and then they just kind of deal with trying to, put their spare mast up and that sort of stuff. But every once in a while, they would encounter the bottom, which is not a good thing for any sort of ship. And so that's why the ships would break apart, okay? So this is a general outline of the type of fleet. So at the head of the fleet, there were several galleons. Now, galleons are warships, okay? So they had the cannons, and they had the troops, and they had either the admiral or the general of the fleet, okay? So they had galleons at the front to protect it. They had galleons at the rear to protect it, and then in the middle were the merchantmen, who were, merchant people that were carrying the goods and stuff, right? That were built in the New World, and they were taking it back. The gold, however, was typically in the galleons because it was well armored, and if they had to, they could run off by themselves and still protect themselves. Whereas if you had a merchant full of treasure, then it's more susceptible to being attacked. And so the main types of the ships were the galleons, which they had the cannons and all the troops, and then these carracks and other types of vessels, which was the merchantmen. And so they sailed fairly slowly, maybe 5 knots on a good day. And that's why they got in the Gulf Stream, which runs between 2 and 5 knots at times. So that just gives them a little boost to head up north to head over back to Spain. And so that's the general outline of a typical treasure fleet heading back to Spain. Now, for this particular one, there were 19 ships that, actually there were 20 ships in the particular fleet that I'm going to be talking about. Almost all of them are either accounted for or have been found, except for the San Fernando, okay? All right, so this is, by switching over from a Mac to a PC, it kind of messes the format up, but the point is that this is a very rare event from history that you had an eyewitness that took the time to very carefully write down the details from start to finish of his particular issue, right, of what happened to him. And so this bottom paragraph here, I'm certainly not going to read it all. It's just telling you about, it's number one, these people were very pious back then, and so these epic poems, it talked about real events, but they used reference to scripture or to other historical events that, most people in this era aren't that familiar with. And so that was part of the stuff that I had to learn about as well, were all these references that went back and forth. And fortunately, this professor, Jerry Gruhl from the University of New Mexico, he translated this from Spanish into English and put some side notes and stuff. So again, this was like a firsthand account of what happened throughout the storm, including the wrecking and being rescued. And so down here at the bottom, as soon as it says, as soon as he, let's see, as soon as he got out of the water onto the island, he lifted up his quill to write this poem because he wanted everything to be fresh in his mind, right? Like if something happens, the sooner you write about it, the more detail you know. So he actually was writing this poem while he was on Long Key and waiting for rescue from Cuba. And so again, he put it into all these different contexts of religion and stuff, but it's still, you can go through and you can figure out what happened, okay? So when it's first assembled, it left on Friday the 13th. Great, right? Let's go. So they left on Friday the 13th, and then they headed out. A few days later, a hurricane came along and pushed almost all the vessels up onto the reefs of the Florida Keys, and they were hit by, and they were wrecked. And then let's see, another thing that this poem does, which others rarely do, is list the actual ships of the fleet. So this was very important from us looking for the San Fernando, because some people were like, well, if it's not there, then it was never there, right? Maybe it had trouble leaving Havana. It stayed there, but it was still on the manifest to go over and stuff, right? Because if you haven't found it after all this time and they found all these other ships, maybe it wasn't even there, okay? So it's very important that the person that swam to shore, and he said, all right, well, the San Fernando, right here, like I said, it moved my ellipse. But anyway, the San Fernando was one of the ships near the island that he was, which is Long Key in the Florida Keys. But back then they called it the Vivora Key, which is the viper, key of vipers, right? Snakes. And so again, there's all these name changes that we have to figure out going through the historical record as well to try to figure out conventionally what the names are. Because when the British took over from the Spanish, I don't know if I can say bastardized, but anyway, they kind of changed the names, right? So like Key West, for instance, it was actually Cayoeso, which is bone key, right? But it sounded like Key West to the British, and so they named it Key West. So there's a lot of little things like that in the Keys that if I'm looking at these historical Spanish documents, I have to find them, contemporarily, I have to do all that stuff as well. So it's kind of cool. And then, okay, so the other thing is, everybody just looks for the shipwreck itself. Well, in wrecking theory, what we call wrecking theory is sometimes you don't know where the ship is, but a few miles away you might find some debris. This is how Mel Fisher found the Atocha. He found some debris and he followed that debris trail, and then there was the main hull, right? Once it finally stuck, because this is exactly what they say. Oh, don't tell me it didn't show up. Anyway, so what it was talking about is these fountains of Vulcan were moving all around the deck and destroying everything, right? Well, those fountains of Vulcan are cannons, because Vulcan is from Hades or whatever place they were talking about, and it would spout fire. Well, that was the cannons. So a lot of these ships had 40 or more cannons on them. And so these things were sliding all around the deck, as you would expect in the middle of a storm. And so they were throwing all these cannons away as they could see the water breaking on the reefs, right? Well, that's several miles away. And so a lot of the shipwrecks, they didn't have any cannons on them because that's exactly what happened, right? So from a search standpoint, if you can find the cannons from a particular ship, and while they're getting blown in, they're throwing everything they can over, including treasure in some cases. So they're throwing everything they can. They're cutting the mast off. They're doing everything they can to save the ship and get to shallow water. And so one of the things that after this project that we're going to do is go out to the deep water and start looking for all these discarded artifacts out there. Because historically, the Keys have been, I'll say, salvaged by divers in shallow water, right? With scuba, or back in the day, they had surface supply. But anyway, in very shallow water, like less than 60 feet of water. Well, details like this say that most of the cool stuff is out there in a couple 100 feet of water, right? But that's a technology area that not a lot of people know how to do. Well, fortunately for myself, well, maybe not unfortunately, for myself, like if we're out in a minefield or something, it's usually deeper water. Well, I know how to do that sort of stuff. And so by using that sort of technology and trying to bring it inshore, that's some other stuff that we did trying to find these wrecks and things, right? So the point is that if you can find the whole story as opposed to, I want to find the wreck because that's where all the stuff is. Well, not necessarily. There's a lot of stuff that's out there that can still be found. And yeah, the 40 spouts refer right here. The 40 spouts refer to the cannons and that sort of thing. And then lastly, oh, let's see, that doesn't really do, like I said, it completely messed up all my references. But importantly, a few days after the storm and after the wreck, this British sailor, John Calcock, came into Havana because, again, other ships of nationalities would come in too. And he said that he saw on the 2nd of July, on the 2nd of July is when the fleet left. And then on the 11th of July, he saw several large ships aground. Now, what's not right with this? The dates, right? And why is that? Yes, ma'am. The Spanish used the Gregorian calendar, and the British used the Julian calendar, which were different by 11 days, right? So when you start looking in, again, you're looking in the resources, if you're not aware of that sort of stuff, you'll be like, well, this can't be, it must be another shipwreck or something, right? There's all this variability that you have to, again, you have to know the context to actually get value out of these notes and stuff. Okay, so you had not only the Spanish, but then you had this British captain that had saw it. He knew about the ships, and he reported that they were aground as well. So that's the written description. That was, again, we're very um, lucky to have that. Then there were 4 charts that were made either at the time of the wrecking, or they were existing charts that then had the ships written on them. Okay, so if you look up here, I don't know how well you can see it, but these are the keys, obviously, and then there's numbered marks all along here that show, and I have a bigger view of it later, but they actually numbered the wrecks and they named them based on where they were along the keys, okay? And again, most of these have been found, and almost all of them were visually found, or a fisherman told someone that they had hooked onto something, right? This is really the only wreck that's left that we have to go back into the archives and try to figure out where it may be, okay? So these are the 4 charts from that time period that we use. This is one in the British Library. And so if you notice, this is zoomed in a little bit more. So it shows, like, if you've ever been to the Keys, there's like Lou Key and some of these other, and Sombrero Key, that sort of stuff, right? If you've ever been down there. And they're listed on here. Wait a minute. Okay, good, it didn't move. So these are the reefs offshore, and then these are the islands, and then these are where the ships are. And then it comes up and it lists the fleet that went aground on the 16th of June, 1733. These are the names of the ships that correspond to the wrecks on the charts. And the La Fragata here, that was heading to St. Augustine. It was just a small ship, and it completely came apart, and that one was completely lost in deep water. So again, there's one of these ships out in deep water somewhere. It couldn't handle the waves, and it just sank. So that's something else to find in deep water, okay? This is another chart that shows the wrecks, and I think I'll come back to this one in a sec. If not, I'll. And then this is so if you sail or anything, you usually get some sailing directions for a particular area you go in, right? It tells you all the things to look out for. Well, that's exactly what this is. So this is sailing directions for coming through the Straits of Florida to Havana, which is right here. And then you just come out, and this is the Straits of Florida, and you go on. So these are instructions. It doesn't say anything about the shipwreck. It says everything about the environment that you have to pass through. What happened was someone came in here and added them, and they added a short little box here, again, with the names of the wrecks, the numbers, and that sort of stuff. Approximate locations on an existing chart. This one was made at the salvage camp. So the Spanish made this so that they could come out, and again, they numbered them, put the names up there. And this is just a zoom in. So I took these, this is what I was looking for in the archives in Spain and in England, trying to get information. And a lot of this work was done in the past. Jack Haskins did a lot of work back in the 60s and he kind of guided me through, not, he was dead, but his work guided me through the archives and stuff, where to look and that sort of stuff. Same thing, these are some of the other, so the names of the shipwrecked fleet in the Keys and the canal. And so again, this is telling you what things are. Now, this is what I wanted to point out. In one of the charts, and I didn't notice this for a while until I started zooming in and trying to rectify these things, is that not only does it show where the wrecks are, it shows the condition of the wrecks, right? So this one still has two masts. This has a mast and actually a crow's nest. This ship was salvaged. It was sailed out. It wasn't damaged bad enough. It hopped over the reef and landed in some sand. But if you look like the San Fernando, all the masts are gone, so it's just a hulk sitting there. This is the San Ignacio, and it's broken. Its back is broken on Washerwoman Shoals. I don't know if anyone's familiar with around Marathon or not, but that's Washerwoman Shoals. La Lavandera, or something like that in Spanish, the Washerwoman Shoals. So that one's completely broken apart, and I think one or two people survived from that one. But this gives you a really good information, as well as some of the references on the islands back again in 1733 that we could use for trying to triangulate some of this stuff. So the closer you look, it's really interesting how a lot of this stuff is present even on these very old charts. So then what I did is I said, okay, so from every map, including a report by the Admiral General, he wrote which ships had foundered, and then from Jack Haskins, the stuff that he found over in Spain, and the yellow are the ones that were floated off. So everything else are the names and every other detail and other details that we could find from each map. So I knew what was there, what not to look for, what not to recognize or retrograde. And then this one down here, the deep site, that's the one that was headed up to St. Augustine. It was just a small ship that was tagging along, but they didn't do very well. So this was the first part, right? Just trying to find out what the charts agreed with the epic narrative, and then try to go from there. So then I had the opportunity to go to Spain, and the Archivo de Indias, those are the archives where most of the documents were sent from Havana back over to Seville, or Sevilla. And so I went in there. And the other thing is San Fernando, the ship San Fernando was from Seville, and San Fernando is the patron saint that that it was named after. So I found the church that he was in. I went in there and tried to look at some artifacts and just kind of get a feel for that sort of thing. Plus, it made a really cool picture. And so this is when I was in Spain. I went through the archives. I was there for a few days, and it's really, really cool to sit there with several hundred-year-old manuscripts and going through, and also trying to read Old Spanish, right? Because it's actually harder to read Old English than it is to read Old Spanish, because English use F's instead of S's and stuff like that, right? But again, after a while, you kind of get used to it. Another thing, there's several churches over there, and they have these mosaic paintings, and so we really weren't sure what the ship looked like. And so on this particular painting, this is she protects the sailors and stuff. They had actual period photographs of the different types of ship. Like that one's a rowed galley. It has everyone's rowing, like you see in some of these, Charlton Heston movies or whatever. And then this is a galleon here and the various other type of ships. So again, that gives us an idea of what we're looking for in terms of how long this thing might be. Because if we see a feature and it's 200 feet long, it's not going to be one of these small ships that are only 50 or 60 feet long. So it gives us a sense of scale as well, right? So how big is this thing we're looking for? So we go from a church to a bar. So this exact same picture is in a mosaic form at this bar. We were just walking over to another place to look, and I'm like, oh, well, there's the map we just saw in the church, right? So I guess this lady's very important. So anyway, but then this is another example that all you have to do is look, and there's usually a lot of information around, and you can hopefully use it. Now this is down, I can never pronounce the name of this river. Guadalajara. Yeah. Okay. Exactly. Thank you. So anyway, so we went down there, and most people won't recognize that as a bollard, right, where you tie a ship up to. Well, I did, and I took a close up of it because who knows? Maybe Columbus or somebody threw a line over that, right? But historically it was here, and then this is the Torre de Oro, or the gold tower, and it used to have gold leaf on the top. It was kind of like a reflective lighthouse for coming up the river and that sort of stuff, right? And so, again, just going down and getting a feel for how these ships were. And just the length of the dockage gives you an idea of how big the ships we are, right? So everything can put a little modicum of information in for you for trying to figure out, again, and when we're looking at remote sensing, which I'll talk about, what I should look for. If it's too big or if it's too small, then don't bother. So this is a picture of Sevilla from from, I think, the 1600s or something. And again, it shows the different types of ships that were the sailing ships that were there. They had these ferries coming across. And then another interesting thing is, anyone know what this site is right here? What they're doing to that ship? Hmm? They actually pull it over. It's called careening. So these ships would get a lot of growth on the bottom, right? Yes, ma'am. So they would put block and tackle on the masts, and they would rotate the whole ship over so that they could get to the bottom and clean it and repair it and that sort of stuff. Exactly. So they're careening sites. And actually, I did another project in the Dominican Republic when we were looking for Columbus's first and second landing sites, and we found one of his careening sites over there, where it was a second voyage, and everyone knows the first three ships, right? But the second voyage, it's like a second kid, right? It's like you know everything about your first kid. But I just call mine Boy, the second one. But anyway, to know that that's how they do it, because when they're chopping all this stuff away, they drop tools, they drop artifacts, and that sort of stuff. So it's just interesting to show that, again, the history of how all this technology evolved and what do we do now. And it's also the city that was the home of the San Fernando. This is another chart. So like when we were trying to see which buildings were which, and because some of the archives mention some of that, this one actually has what do you call it, where the names are on the bottom, a legend or whatever, down here telling you where the different buildings are. And yeah, that's the river that I can't pronounce. The Seville River, let's call it. Yes. Yeah, I'll get it. I'll practice on the way home. Guadalclavia, whatever. I was lucky to get oro out of gold. But anyway, so that's just, again, the stuff. And then this is in the Navy Museum in Madrid. I went to Madrid. And these are scale models back, because when they used to build ships long ago, and I've noticed, I have given this talk at the Naval Academy a few times, but I noticed up there, back hundreds of years ago, they didn't have ship plans. The shipwrights made a model, and then they built it from the model, right? And these are some of the shipwright models that they had for these particular, and again, this is what a rowed galley down here. And the reason I keep mentioning a rowed galley is because I also spent some time in Dominican Republic looking for a rowed galley. We never found it, but they kicked us out. Not for anything we did, but anyway, it was the details. But there's a rowed galley down there somewhere that I'll find one of these days. Okay, and then so I went to the British Library and looked at some of these charts, but something that hadn't been found, at least I haven't found anybody else that had located this particular book, and I had them scan it for a lot of pounds, is this is a list from the General Admiral Torres of each vessel and what was salvaged from it, okay? And so for the San Fernando, they salvaged silver and mojado, which is it's like a dye, like a red dye, kind of, because they used to ship a lot of that because it's a tropical plant, and they would ship it back to. And then arrobas are kind of like, I think they're 25-pound units or something like that of anil, which yeah, yeah. Anyway, but this is some of the stuff that they salvaged off San Fernando. So if the admiral said they were salvaging stuff off of it, then it was there, right? So it wasn't left back in Havana. It was there. There was another one of these documents that I didn't have a picture of, that it actually showed the dates that this stuff was taken off each ship. And they started salvaging it in July, depending on which calendar you use. And the last ship that they finished salvaging was in January of 1734, and it was the San Fernando. So it was there, okay? So they pretty much picked everything off of it. And in the New World, they would take even the spikes, the nails, everything, because everything you brought in from Spain, mostly, and so they would completely salvage everything. And that's one of the reasons that some other technology may or may not have worked for people. Okay, so that's all the background, the history of the ships and everything. And so now, so we've got these charts. They have longitude and latitudes marked on them. But how did they determine longitude and latitude back then, right, in the early 1700s? Because there certainly wasn't GPS. There wasn't even sextants that you could use, right? And the way that you measure longitude, which is the north-south lines on a map or on a globe, is you need a start point, and then since the Earth rotates 15 degrees an hour, if you know how many hours you are from that point, you can figure out how many degrees you are from that point, right? So if you, and like these days, Greenwich, England is the prime meridian, which is 0 degrees longitude. So if it's noon in Greenwich and it's 8 a.m. where you are, that's 4 hours difference. So you're 60 degrees from Greenwich at that point. Does that make sense? But you need a really accurate clock, right? I mean, for degrees, it's one thing. But if you try to get down to the seconds or a really accurate position, you need an accurate way of time. So this is essentially what the Spanish had in 1733. They may have had a few other things like a log line and stuff, but they had an astrolabe up here, and they had an inclinometer. And both of these devices were used to determine the latitude. And what the latitude is how far north and south you are of the equator. So if you take a shot on the sun and you measure the angle from the horizon to the sun and you know the day, you can figure out your latitude, okay? So they had latitude pretty much. The Phoenicians had latitude down, right, to an art. But longitude was a challenge up until the late 1700s, and this was in 1733. So the question is, well, how accurate are these charts? How close could they be, right? Now, later on, like I said, that's the cross staff, and that's how you determined your latitude. And so if I had one, I would put it at the horizon, and then the top, I would match it to the sun, okay? And that angle would tell me my latitude. So you ever see all these pirate movies or even pictures of pirates? What do a lot of them have? What are they wearing on their face? Right? It ain't from fighting Bluebeard or whatever. It's just because they may be navigators and they have burned their eyes out looking at the sun for so many years, trying to figure out where they are, right? So anyway, so that was an issue with the cross staff, is that you actually had to look at the sun. Now later developments, and the Spanish may or may not have had them, this is a back staff, and so the sun's light would come through a slot and reflect. So you put your back to the sun. It's like a beam of light that comes through, and you adjust that, and that's how you can tell your latitude. And then that's a quadrant over there, which now has lenses, so you can see it a little bit better. And then the modern day is the sextant, right? So it's one-sixth of a circle, and it has glass filters so you can actually look straight at the sun, and she can see not only the horizon but also the angle of the sun because there are mirrors in here. So you can, on one view, you can see the horizon and the sun, and you bring them close together, and then that tells you the angle, and that's how you get your latitude. Okay? Hmm? Oh, so John Hadley did the quadrant, and that was in the mid 1700s in England. But it's a state secret, right? So they didn't just say, here, everybody in Europe use one of these to improve your navigation. So the Spanish didn't really have access to as high technology as what was going on in London and building those things, right? Same thing with the clock, which I'll just talk about. The Spanish didn't have access to that either because, again, it was a state secret. Okay? Now, like I said, if your latitude is if you look at the angle between the sun, but the problem is every day that angle changes, right? So let's see if this will play. Yeah, okay. So the winter solstice is the lowest point that the sun is going to be. So you see from east to west, that's as high above the horizon it's going to be, right? I mean, this is a demonstration. It changes from where you are. Whereas the spring equinox, which means it's over the equator, directly over the equator. See how it's higher than in the winter, right? So if you're taking a shot and you think it's winter or summer, well, it's kind of hard to do here, well, not in Florida. But anyway, you need to know what day you're measuring it as well. And then in the middle of summer, you get the summer solstice, which is it's the highest it is in the northern hemisphere, right? It's at 23.5 degrees, and it's straight above the earth. And so see how high it is. So again, you need to know accurately what day it is. So one of the questions is, well, if one's using the Julian and one's using the Gregorian calendars, which latitudes are they using, right? Because we have British charts and we have Spanish charts. So those days can change, and it might not seem like a lot, but if you're looking for something basically the size of this first row here, that could be a big difference in position, right? So that's just a little overview about how the sun changes throughout the year, and it goes up and down just like that. Okay? So the British decided that they would established a royal observatory in Greenwich, England, and they put it up on the hill here in Greenwich. And this top view is a view from the Thames, the river. I got that one right, right? Thames. All right. I didn't say Thames. I used to. But anyway, from the Thames River. And so what would happen is it's just like on New Year's in New York City. So every day at 1 p.m., the astronomers would lower that ball from the top here, they would lower it down. And as soon as it got to the bottom, that was 1 p.m., and the ships could set their chronometers to that time. Okay? Now, why is it at 1 in the afternoon instead of at high noon? Well, they're taking all these measurements that I talked about, right? And they need time to calculate it. So they take a noon shot because when you're doing it, you have to wait till the sun gets perfectly above you. So you watch it until it goes past that apogee, right? And then it goes, okay, and then you back up and you say, okay, well, it was right there. So they needed an hour to do these calculations. So they would tell them it was 1 o'clock instead of noon. So that's another cool thing, right? That the technology that was available, they had to use that sort of thing. Okay, so, and how did they see the angles of the sun? Well, this was kind of pre-telescope. I mean, Galileo had figured it out in the late 1400s, but there was still a lot of progress to do. But the larger the angle that you can look at something, the less the error is, right? Because you have a lot of room between each mark. So these are called mural quadrants. A mural, because it's on the wall, right? That one's mounted to the wall. See how large it is. And then this one's looking out the window. And so you would sight, say, a particular star at night, you would sight through there's a small hole here, and you'd move along this outside arc until you saw it. You would mark the time as well as you could. And then that's how you would tell the angles to the stars. And that's how they made all these star maps that they then used for navigation and stuff. Okay? So again, and this was at Greenwich Observatory. It's so cool. I mean, it might be my engineering nerd coming out, but it's so cool to see how they did all this complicated stuff back in the day with very little. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's very cool. Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, I haven't been brave enough to go under that one, but yeah, it's leaky. Someone told me it's kind of leaky, or yeah, damp. Okay, yeah. There's a big difference between damp and leaky, isn't it? Especially on your ship. Okay. So anyway, so this was a really cool thing to go and actually see how, because again, what we're trying to do is quantify the numbers that we're going to get within some error band, right? And so you can plus or minus, you can figure out plus or minus how accurate they can do all this sort of stuff. Okay, so John Harrison, okay? There was a huge British shipwreck off the Scilly Isles back in 1704, I think, where thousands of sailors died because they didn't have accurate longitude. And so Queen Anne made this longitude prize and said anybody can do it within a certain resolution can win all this money. And so John Harrison is the one that built this H4. This is a pocket watch, but it was extremely accurate, not only in England, but in the South Pacific, in the equators, everything, because it had to deal not only with keeping time, but the changes in temperature, humidity, all that sort of stuff. So it has all this technology in it to do that sort of thing and to keep very accurate time. But he's the one that basically made the first marine chronometer that could be very accurate. So these are his first 2 tries. Let's see if this will, please run. There it is. So this is H1, okay? So you can't use a pendulum on a ship, which most pendulum clocks were, because the ship's rolling, right? And so the pendulum's all over the place. So he had these 2 independent brass these balls up there that were going back and forth and keeping time. It was their own self-contained clock device, right? But you can see all I guess I was nervous or something, but all the intricate designs inside, and then he also had these things down here, if it'll show, these things down here that are counterbalances, so you could tweak everything. And because it was going to be in humid environments, the bearings were actually wood. Lignum vitae, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a wood that has oils actually naturally in it, so it self-lubricates. and because he was a carpenter by trade, and so all the bearings were that because he knew if you tried to oil something, it would mess up in the humidity and all that sort of stuff. And interestingly, there's a key down in the Florida Keys, Lignum Vitae Key. I don't know if you've ever been down there, but if you are and you feed the tarpon, don't put your hand too far because a guy at work, he took his like little son down there and he was giving the tarpon a fish, and these tarpon are like this big, and it took him all the way up to his arm, so he had to pull him back in. That's another video. Oh, dude, what happened to my? Okay, did something happen? Let me go back. Okay, so this is H2. And so see now he's just using a rotating disc because he figured these are too cumbersome. But again, it's a self-contained clocking device. And so it clocks back and forth, it counts up to a minute, and then as it returns itself, it'll go too fast unless you have a brake on it. And so what he used was this air braking system. You'll see it as soon as it gets to a minute. See? So it's rewinding itself, but he controlled the speed by the size of this air brake, basically. It's like a fan wheel. So that's how he did, and these were very accurate. But finally, he realized these were way too cumbersome, and that's why he came up with H4 at the very end. H3 didn't work out, but this is what he finally did. And Captain James Cook had these out on his explorations and all that sort of stuff. But this was really the first time that you could have a very accurate time base at sea. And so now we're back to these charts again, just showing that, so what are the coordinates and stuff, right? Well, these are called loxodromes. So they're not lines of longitude or latitude, they're the winds of the direction of the winds, okay? Because they used to sail by the winds. And so you have north-south, east-west, and you have northeast, southwest, and all these different, they would go up to 32 directions of the wind some of these times that they were trying to figure out where they were going. So anyway, these are loxodromes, not lines of latitude and longitude. So again, you have to figure all that stuff out. And so I said Greenwich is the prime meridian, right, these days. But that was only until I think 1880 or something, when it was decreed that Greenwich, England is going to be 0. Before that, all the other countries would be like, we'll be wherever we want, right? We'll put our prime meridian. And so for this particular chart, it's at Havana. And if you've ever been over to I haven't, I want to, but been over to the fort in Havana, right? They just decided, well, we'll make that 0, either 360 or 0, or basically north on their charts, the way we look at it. And that's why when I was doing the coordinate calculations, I couldn't use, because normally this is around 24 degrees latitude, 80 degrees longitude. Well, now it's either 358 or it's 2 or 3. So again, trying to correlate all this stuff to something that we can use. Now, the first really accurate chart of the Keys was made by George Gauld in 1777. He decided he didn't want to mess with the revolution, so he came down and he mapped the Keys. And he's a British guy out of Pensacola. Anyway, but he had really accurate things, because what it needed to do was take these old charts, put them over an accurate chart, and then try to what's called georectify them, right? I tried to make them fit. And the closer to the event, the less changes would happen on the charts, right? And this also shows if you were out in a boat at a certain distance, what the islands would look like. So it's very accurate, but the clocks were really expensive. They weren't even invented yet. And so how do you think he could determine longitude without a clock? Galileo figured it out, but it was really hard to implement on a boat. But he was on land, so it was easier. So was Lewis and Clark. They used the same method. So how do you think? The moons of Jupiter. Okay? So if you look through a telescope, a good telescope, you can see the moons of Jupiter, right? If anybody's done it. Well, if you watch it, they'll become occluded. So you'll see this one right here is going to go into the, so it blinked out and it blinked back on. And that's very, very periodic. So, these are Galileo's notes down here on how he watched them throughout a month and tried to figure out where the moons were. But anyway, so if you have a chart of when this happens at some port, wherever you're referencing to, and you time it where you're at, it's just like having a clock. If it happens 4 hours later, you're 60 degrees from wherever they measured it the first time, right? So they used the moons of Jupiter as a clock back in the day, before they came up with real clocks and stuff. Okay? So again, all this, it's just technology transfer from very basic stuff up until GPS satellites and cesium clocks and all that sort of stuff. Okay? Everybody cool so far? All right. Okay, and so this is, again, these are triangulations that he did. So, he would be out on this island, which, has anyone dove on Sombrero Key or familiar with Sombrero Key down in the Keys, ironically? Well, now it's submerged, right? It's just a submerged reef. But back in about 100, 200 years ago, it was a dry island. It would flood from time to time, but they were able to sit out there and take all these measurements, and that's why they could get a very accurate chart of the Keys. The other thing I looked at was when they were building the railroad out there in 1907, they hadn't reached the site that we were interested in. Now, when Flagler went through there, he changed a lot of the shapes of the keys just to try to pave it in so that he wouldn't have to put a bunch of bridge pilings in, right? So a lot of the shapes of the keys were destroyed because of the railroad. But the Spanish, it was pristine back then, and so I had to go back in time and find a chart as close to I could. So 1907 is a lot better than 1777, right? So this was the closest surveyed chart that I could find to use for what's called the georectification, where I take one chart and lay it on the other and try to make them fit. This is just more details. So now this is 1907 chart. This is one of them from 1733. So long key, you can see that the shapes are different. So, but are the positions the same, right? So all the different charts I went through and I tried to correlate them. And the other thing is, well, do the charts even show things that are accurate? So on one chart, it said down near Key West, there are these 3 keys, the Sambo keys down here. One chart says there's 2 little ones and a big one to the east. One chart says there are 2 big ones and a little one to the east. One chart says there are 2 big ones and a little one to the east, right? All 3 of them are wrong. Only one of the charts shows it properly. A big one to the west, 2 little ones to the east. So either they copied each other, which certainly happened a lot, or they just made a mistake. So when you're trying to figure out which one is telling the truth, right? This is just one more piece of the big ass puzzle that you have to try to figure out what is valid and what's not, which one to trust. Okay. So again, it's the devil in the details of trying to go from something that's 300 or 400 years ago and bring it into now to try to go out with your ship and stick something in the bottom and say, oh, there it is. Okay, so this is one of the charts, and so by hand, I don't know if you can see or not, but these are all the lines that I drew for every wreck and every point on here trying to get a position from these historical charts. So this is the first chart, second chart, and you can see where I'm drawing all these different lines. And so this chart didn't even have a longitude, right? So I used latitude as the metric to see how it agreed with today, because that's the one that they can most accurately measure. So you do all that stuff, you put the charts, you scan the charts and put them in the computer, and then the green is the very, very accurate shape of the coast right now. This is GIS, the Geographical Information System. And so I overlaid the actual state of Florida the way it is today over one of the contemporary charts. And you can see how they kind of agree, but they don't agree, again, enough to go out there and put a flag in the bottom, right? So there's all, and actually by researching for this talk, I got very tired because I'm like, holy crap, I did all this stuff? Because I did it like 10 years ago. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to know, using new technology of LiDAR and the robotic instruments that can actually go down
Mm-hmm.
and do very technological research,
Mm-hmm.
what has been done regarding using that technology, if anything, with the San Fernando?
So the San Fernando is in no deeper than 20 feet. And so, I've built underwater robots and I own them and but these are still way in advance of robotics, right? So use robotics when it's very deep and you have to, you can't send a diver down to do it. But when it's shallow like this, it's much better to just have humans down there doing their thing, right? Now, as far as remote sensing, yeah, LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging, it's kind of like sonar, where sonar, if you're familiar, it sends out a ping of sound, it reflects off something and comes back, tells you how far it is, right? Same thing with a laser. You fly a laser over the water, and you use 2 different colors. You use a red laser, and it bounces off the surface of the water, and tells you how far you are. And a green laser bounces off the bottom, and then you subtract the two, and that tells you the depth of the water, right? So you can basically go over and scan the bottom with that. They're very expensive. They require very clear water. And also, light gets absorbed a lot faster, so it only goes down to about 120 feet or so before you can't use LiDAR anymore. But again, in these waters, it's easier to snorkel and look with your eyes. Now, where the cannons are that I was talking about on 200-300 feet of water, absolutely. That's for robots and all these other remote sensing stuff. But for the shallow water stuff, people are still the best. One thing in this world, right? But yeah, exactly. That's why I'm saying this is one thing that we can still do better than the machines. But we all watch Terminator. That's going to end one of these days. Anyway, so this just does that answer your? Is that okay? Okay. So this is what's called georectification, where I'm trying to just put all this stuff into the real world and figure out where to go look now. Okay, so this is just a little. So I figured out the latitude numbers for the 4 charts and the modern where ships have actually been found. And you'll notice that this is where the San Fernando is, number 18 right here. So there's no red dot because we haven't found it yet. But the closer you are to the San Fernando, the closer it matches chart 2, right? But the further you get away, the error spreads. And that's typical of when you're taking a shot on something, trying to get an angle for something. The farther it is away, the larger your error is, right? It's just the way that the math works. And so what this indicates is that wherever they made these charts, at least most of the parts of them, they were somewhere very close to the San Fernando. And that goes back to that story I told you at the beginning, where he was on the same key, Cayo Vibra, or the Viper key, which is now Long Key. That's where they took these measurements and drew the charts from, because that was kind of like the salvage camp. So that gives you a little bit more confidence in chart 2 as opposed to these other charts, right? Because there's an offset here. Does that make sense? So the closer you are to something, you can measure it better, and it opens up with time. Okay, so that was longitude and latitude. Now we've got magnetic variation coming up. So over time, if you use a regular compass, it's not going to point to true north, which is what latitude and longitude is. It's going to point to magnetic north, okay? So this is on a chart. So it says here, every year, it's going to increase to the west 14 minutes. So see how that's true north, which is the North Star, and this is where your compass. So if you want to go to true north, you have to subtract that amount to go according to your position, right? Oh, that's cool. And if it was constant like that, it would be fine. But it changes all the time. In 1701, Edmund Halley made this chart, and this is the line in 1701 that the North Star was right on the compass. That's the Igonic 0 line. So if you looked at your compass and you looked at the North Star, they'd be perfectly right. Everywhere else on either side, you have these variations that you have to account for, but it changes every year. And so from 1750 to 2012, I think, is when I did this, it changes from 4 degrees, you got to correct it to the west, to the east, to 6 degrees, you got to correct it to the west. So again, you have to go back in time and figure out if they were actually using their compasses and they knew about magnetic variation, some of these bearings might be wrong, right? You don't know how they made the measurement. So again, you have to cover all your bases and see how it could vary. Now, in this particular case, they said that it runs at 78 degrees, and then which would be 68 degrees now, but if you correct, they both mean true. So sailors knew about magnetic variation long before this, so you can assume that the Spanish knew that as well. So all these bearings on these charts should be in true, which means to the North Star. But if you go through all the analysis and it's off, then you can back up and say, all right, well, maybe they didn't correct their compasses, and look for that, right? And all this is for each chart and each rec, I went through and saw what the bearings were. So these agreed really well. But the further you get away from a certain point, like I said, the bearings change, and now you've got a large spread on where they are. So if that's an artifact of them being far away and trying to measure it, or if they didn't use magnetic variation in their calculations, okay? So I hope this isn't too boring, but I mean, the devil's in the details, is what I said, right? You have to really get down into this stuff. So, so how do we find this thing? And I think you had alluded to it, or someone had alluded to it. You go down and you look for it. We can't visually see it because it's going to have growth all over it. It might be buried, so you can't use sonar or LiDAR, so you have to use another property. And a lot of the materials on old ships were made of what? Iron, right. Wood and iron, exactly, which is magnetic. Okay, the Earth, as we just talked about, has a magnetic pole and a geographic pole, which points towards the North Star, but they have all these flux lines, magnetic flux lines, they call it. So even right here, the magnetic field in this room from the Earth right now, for the most part, are just parallel lines running beside each other. If you put a big magnet in the middle, it's going to distort those lines. It's going to bend them from its magnetism, right? That's what ship parts are. They're just magnets. So you can see how they can distort the magnetic field all around them. So you throw it in there, it's called an anomaly. You have these nice straight lines, you throw something in there, it screws it all up, like a step parent or something. No, I'm just kidding. That's terrible. But so you put it in there. So you put it in there, it distorts everything, and you got to figure out how to make it work, right? So I'm just it's a joke. I don't know why I said that. So these are called magnetometers, and so what they do is they measure the magnetic fields of the Earth, and you look for anomalies in it. This is a cesium magnetometer. It uses gaseous cesium, and this one down here, it's a proton magnetometer. It uses unleaded gasoline, okay? Because molecules or atoms are magnets as well. And so they spin on their axis unless the magnetic field affects them, and then they tilt. And then when you get away from that field, they come back, but they bounce. It's like a top, right? It bounces back and forth. It's called precession. And so when you go by something magnetic in an existing field, it can measure the difference in the local field, okay? This one's really expensive, and it's a couple hundred grand. This one's good enough, and it's about 20 grand. So, but it's all based on the resolution that you're looking for. So you tow it behind a ship. You have a GPS antenna to know where you are. You tow it behind a ship, and here's that magnet that I just showed you, right? So if any steel iron on the ship deflects the Earth's magnetic fields, it changes it. So see it, this is the field here. It bends down, and then it comes back up, okay? So you tow this back and forth. We're looking for any changes in the Earth's background magnetic field. When you see it, you're like, okay, cool. So I've got something here. So then you go 90 degrees, and you come back this way. You just go all over it and try to figure out exactly where that is. When you plot it out, that's an anomaly. So the yellow and the blue are the Earth's background. It's very constant, right? But when you get a magnetic anomaly in there, it shows up, in this case, really well because it's a modern wreck. But that's how you go out and you find, that's the smoking gun, if you will, right? Something magnetic is down there. And so it could be the ship's iron cannonballs, it could be any cannons they may have thrown over, anything like that. So that's how you go out and look for it if you can't see it visually on the bottom, okay? And that's why, though, it's very important you know where to look because you can only cover probably 10 feet or so with these at high resolution. So we did that. So these are two areas where we did magnetometer measurements, and every little red dot is a measurement. It's not, and they're all showing basically the same. But right in this area here, which is close to the San Fernando, we got a really big hit right in this area on the magnetometers. That's why those circles are much larger, right? So like, oh, cool, we found it finally. Well, it turns out, this is me under there, this turns out that it was an iron mast from a ship from the 1800s. So the sensor worked perfectly. It just picked up the wrong thing, right? Exactly. So this is me, we're measuring it, and so I have a cable going up to a buoy that has a GPS on it. Comes down through the cable, and I have a little waterproof screen, and so I'll pull it tight, and then I'll write down the position, and then I'll swim to the other side, and that's how we measure everything on the bottom, right? Because radio or GPS doesn't go through the water, it gets absorbed. And so I built this thing to go up and down to measure all these artifacts. So that's the mast back there, right? So that's the thing, it's like 60 feet long. So where's the other part of a ship that's in this picture? Where's that at? Over here? Right there? There or? Just throw something. No, I'm just kidding. Right there. Okay. Okay, that's a piece of cable, but it's metal as well. Absolutely. That's what I'm talking about. That. It's like, right? So that gives you an idea of growth only for over 150 years. That's how much it grows, and that's how much it can camouflage itself, right? So what is that? Okay, and this is when we're doing the surveys underwater, we have to have the name of the project, the NOAA and the Florida State numbers, and we have to have scales, because now from this picture, I can use those bars right there and I can measure it, right? So I can take a scale in the computer and I can measure and see how big that is. So this was, I think, 2011 or 14 or 11, I can't remember. And then this was a little earlier. This was in 2012. So the other one must have been in 14. So that's the same artifact that we saw, and the way we found it was with a metal detector. Okay. So I went back into the archives. This is a book on old sailing ships, and that's the object right there. It's a yard arm truss. So it takes the mast and it connects the crossbar that holds the sails on it. So then I happened to be in, I think this is in Barcelona. So you can see the yard arm truss right there on a sailing ship from the 1800s. It was contemporary with that. And then this is the Star of India in San Diego. Yeah. And there's the same structure. So this was common on these sailing ships. But the point is that we did find a shipwreck. It just wasn't the one we were looking for. But we were able to go back and identify all this stuff and test out our technology, right? I mean, it was a good test. And then these are just a few other artifacts. Like this is a pulley from that same shipwreck. This is where the crow's nest sits. So it slides over the mast, and then the crow's nest is out here. So that's what that part was. But it just gives you an idea of not only the growth, but the corrosion, right? That's really rusted. And then that's just a picture of me measuring a device. And you see how I plumb the buoy. I pull it down tight, and that gives me a really good image of everything. And then this is pointing to magnetic north. So when we go back through the pictures, we have to look at the date so that we can come back and correct it to true, right? Because it's a lot harder to measure true with a magnetic compass. We just write down. Now that we're all, so we determined that this is the missing parts of the Adelaide Baker, which is an actual shipwreck trail. That's what this here shipwreck. The Florida Keys has what's called a shipwreck trail. And so you can go out and you can dive on these ships, these shipwrecks, hence the name. But what I found is we went and we measured this too. And by using my buoy, we found that they printed the map backwards. They had flipped it when they printed the map by the thousands. And so when you go out there, this is actually the line of the mast, not that way. So everything, and I guess it's an honest mistake. They went to print it, but they just flipped the drawing over and then became history. They weren't too thrilled about it, however. Probably my word choice, but I read it to Melissa last night. She's like, dude, you shouldn't have said that. But anyway, but the point is that the technology worked, and then you can actually see that in satellite pictures and see that that's the mast. So that's kind of like, the charting, how do you determine their longitude, how do you correct that to common stuff, how do you search for it, how do you use magnetic variation, and then when you actually go out and you find an anomaly on the bottom, how do you correlate that to an actual vessel that had sank, or go back and try to research what it was, right? Okay. And that's it.